Today's demonstration is Nålbinding. Now, Nålbinding is a forerunner of crochet and knitting. It's similar in a lot of ways, but it's a much earlier craft, obviously. If I show you this hat, you can see that it looks, for all intents and purposes, as though it's been knit, but the stitch is much denser, and it's really difficult to push your fingers through anything that's been knol bound. It also differs in one huge way in that it doesn't unravel. So you can stop at any time and put it down, and if you pull the thread, it won't unravel. The stitch means that it, if at any time it was damaged, quite a lot of times it might have been something piercing it. It might have been the tip of a sword or a knife, or it could go through and it wouldn't unravel. Then all they would have to do is stitch it back up, and that made it a lot better wear, and it made it a lot more practical. It's an ancient craft. We do know that Nålbinding existed in these forms. There were a number of different stitches. In York, at the Coppergate Dig, a sock was found that had obviously been created by using Nålbinding. It was the same kind of stitches. It didn't unravel. It was heavily rotted, but there were large portions of it that were still intact. So we do now know that Nålbinding existed in this form. You see it a lot in reenactment. It's also quite different from knitting and crochet in that you tend not to work from a pattern. You tend to measure the person that you're making the item for. Now, these are just some arm guards, some winter gloves, if you like, that I've got to put the thumb part on at the moment. So how you make it is you measure the person's hand, which is very handy for me because I have huge hands and quite small wrists. And then you start the first row, and then you keep working your way down. Then you work out how far it is between the person's finger and thumb, so you can make that part fit. I like a bit more space because I like to be able to move my thumb. Then you can measure that bit, so you do the next bit and you go round and back, round and back. Then you get down to the wrist and you measure it so that it shouldn't be baggy. It should fit properly. Now you can start there and work your way up, or you can start there and work your way down. I tend to start there and work my way down the glove. There are ways of actually putting the thumb part in, but I like to do them separately because it just means that I have really quite strange shaped thumbs, so you can fashion the thumb a little bit better. This is chunky acrylic wool. You should really, with Nålbinding, be using pure wool, but it is very difficult to get, and when you do get it, it's quite expensive. I do spin some of my own sometimes for these sort of projects, and I will a little bit later show you the difference between that and real wool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some of the stitches. Okay, so Nålbinding is done on the thumb of your secondary hand and just with a needle used in your primary hand. You can do it either way. If you're left-handed, you can do it the other way around. And it really is quite simple in that it's very basic stitches. There are different stitches. This is a very basic one. But what you do is, to do a row, you take a stitch from the row below, you wind it round the one you have in your finger, you put it under that one, and under the wool, and then you pull it through. It's best to keep the wool that you're using in fairly short pieces. It's an annoyance because you have to keep joining it on, but it will just tangle up beyond use if you don't. You can't use massively long pieces because it just gets in the way and it becomes impossible to manage. When you've got it onto your thumb, you tighten the one that you've just put on, that's that one, but the one above that was already on there, you slip it over your nail onto that part of your thumb, and now you're ready for your next stitch. So you go down below and you pick up the next stitch and you roll it round, round, through, pull the wool through, and you're back to there, and you tighten it slightly, tighten it on your nail. The one that tightens is the one you keep, the one that doesn't is the one that you slip over your nail, and that goes into your next stitch. And that is how that's achieved. Again, with knot binding, the brilliant part of it is you can take it off at any time and it won't unravel. Now I'm not going to do this, but if I pull that now, it will just tighten those stitches and nothing will happen. This will stay intact. What I do to preserve it, and I sometimes leave it in my bag for weeks, months, I get my needle and I go over a couple of times and then I just put it in there and I leave it like that. Now you will notice that I'm using a metal needle. For knot binding, if you're doing it as part of a reenactment, you wouldn't use a metal needle. The knot binding needles would be usually made of bone or of wood. Now these are just some examples of the size and the shape of needle. So they're usually about 5 centimetres long, something like that, or 2 to 3 inches. And they are usually made of a hardish wood that has been whittled down and it's been smoothed, because they have to be smoothed to go through the wool. It's got a large eye because you have to be able to get the wool through. Now this is some hand-spun wool that I did myself, and you can see that I've been using the knot binding stitch. You can actually see at the end I should have there 2 stitches, but you can also see I've taken it off and I've pulled it and nothing happens, doesn't come apart at all. Now the difference between that and that as a stitch is fairly obvious. This is looser because I'd done it looser. I mean, obviously you can use hand spun yarn in any thickness. This is a little bit thick. But the main difference is when you're joining a new piece on, if you're using acrylic, you have to do a very complicated and long-winded process of threading it through the old piece of yarn and back again, and you will always have a little bump or a little lump or a little piece that sticks out. When you're using natural wool, 100% wool, all you have to do is get another piece of wool and you would just put them together. I usually open it up a bit so that the wool catches. You'd put them together and then you would move them around in your fingers. I'd usually damp it a little bit because and what would happen is they would hook together, so the join would just be a continuation of the wool instead of a lump and a bump. I'm not going to do it now because it takes a few minutes. So that's the main difference between using pure natural wool and acrylic wool. The thing with Nålbinding is that it is incredibly warm and incredibly tough. And when you think about where it comes from, that it was for the most part used by the Danish and Norwegian Vikings, and some a bit later on, some of the Saxon groups, it's been found in some of their digs. Some of the Nålbinding needles have been found. It's mainly because they lived in such harsh conditions, and it would have probably been used underneath helmets or underneath chainmail, because you can knit anything this way. You can Nålbind anything. It could be tunics, it could be hats, gloves, leggings, socks, anything. They would have been incredibly tough, and they would have been very difficult to destroy. So if you got a hole in it, you would just darn that hole and it wouldn't spread. So they were quite long lasting as well. It's a fascinating craft, like so many of the ancient crafts. But I just thought today I would show you the very basics of Nålbinding. So yet again, there we are, ancient craft that you may never have seen before, but it came before knitting, before crocheting, centuries before these things, and yet it's still something that very few people know about. That's Nålbinding.